So my friends, if we talk to you about espionage, about real spies, not about James Bond 007, it is more than likely that the operations of Mossad, the CIA, and the powerful intelligence services of Russia, or even the Chinese, would quickly come to mind. In fact, to this day, it is still not unheard of to come across news stories like this.
US closes Chinese consulate in Houston amid surge in Chinese espionage cases. Norway arrests man suspected of spying for Russia.
The world of intelligence is not only fodder for cinema and literature, but it also remains a fundamental pillar in the security policies and influence of many countries. Fighting against terrorism, keeping an eye on your adversaries, and also on your friends. Looking for secrets, punishing your enemy, or meddling in the political workings of a hostile country in order to destabilize it, these are just some of the most common operations of an activity that takes place in a very different world from the one that we know. A world of shadows, suspicions, and distrust. A world, my friends, where the rule of law does not always act as an effective boundary. Not to mention, of course, the danger that can come from espionage carried out by countries without limits. Countries where human rights, democracy, and personal freedom are conspicuous by their absence. But to what extent do such activities pose a risk to democracies, freedom, and international stability? And what exactly are the risks that we face? Well, my friends, in order to answer these questions in this video, we have to travel to the Korean Peninsula. And there it is. Take a look. If we had to give you one example of a country that has lived in an ongoing espionage war, that country would be none other than South Korea. As you no doubt know, the Korean Peninsula is the last place on Earth where the Cold War not only never ended, but is as alive today as it was in any previous decade since the 1950s. The incursions of South Korean spies into North Korea, and much more frequently that of North Korean spies into South Korea, has been a constant for decades. Let's just say that since the Korean War armistice was signed in 1953, in terms of espionage, there has been no truce. Of the two countries, the one that has done by far the most damage has been North Korea. A country that has not only planted spies, but also produced elite units trained to carry out attacks in the south. So, what do you say? Would you like to know more about what is probably the darkest aspect in the coexistence of two ideologically opposed states, like North and South Korea? If you do, let's get cracking.
Espionage, a method of survival for Kim.
So friends of VisualPolitik, in order to better understand what we are going to tell you later on, we must first look back and see where this all began. Specifically, we have to move to the middle of the 20th century. After liberation from Japanese occupation in 1948, the Korean Peninsula was left divided in two, with one half under a communist government akin to the Soviet Union, and the other under a conservative government akin to the United States and the West. However, that wasn't where it all ended. Tensions between the two regimes resulted in the North Korean invasion of the South in 1950, an invasion that led to a war that did not stop until 1953, when a ceasefire was agreed upon, an armistice that is still in effect today. However, far from reaching peace and tranquility, the subsequent decades have been plagued by provocations, attacks, espionage, and assassination attempts. These actions are fundamentally aimed at destabilizing the other side, something that North Korea has been able to push to the absolute limit. Let's just say that the Kims have made their intelligence services their prized weapon in the world. It doesn't matter whether it's to intimidate its enemies, gain strength at the negotiation table, steal industrial secrets, punish potential opponents, or even seek ways to circumvent international sanctions, the North Korean secret services play a key role, essential to the survival of that communist dictatorship. And it is precisely because spies are so important to the regime that the North Korean government considers them to be the most senior officials possible. To give you an idea, they are on a par with the generals of the Korean People's Army itself. In this way, spies have many privileges, such as high salaries, access to higher education, and the ability to travel abroad. Which, of course, is not at all common in one of the most secretive and isolated countries in the world. Now, some of you may be wondering, but Grant, what exactly are we talking about? How far do these operations go? What role does espionage really play? And are you going to butcher more Korean names in this episode? Do you want details and concrete examples? If you do, listen up.
A history of provocations.
If the North Korean regime's hierarchies share one obsession, it is to make life impossible for their southern neighbours. Thus, while the type of espionage carried out by South Korea has been primarily aimed at gathering military information and information on the country's future plans, North Korean espionage has been very, very different. Obviously, in this video, we are not going to be able to talk about each and every one of the known operations that have been carried out, which are many. But we are going to tell you about some of the most striking ones. And so, my friends, to understand the first one, we have to travel back to the 1960s. At that time in the South, President Park Chung-hee was governing, and he had come to power after a coup d'etat. And look, I did butcher the names, who'd have thought? This man, who by the way is the father of the now imprisoned former president of South Korea, was a deeply conservative and anti-communist military man. As you can imagine, it's a character description that the North Korean dictator Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current leader, did not like very much at all. Park's hard line against North Korea, his persecution of everything that seemed even mildly left-wing, and the diplomatic and commercial openness that he set in motion and that put South Korea on the international map for the first time were more than enough reasons to literally put Park in the bullseye. There were at least two North Korean attempts to assassinate Park Chung-hee. The first one was in January 1968. 31 soldiers from an elite unit of the Korean People's Army infiltrated South Korea, reaching the Blue House itself, the South Korean president's residence in Seoul. The North Korean command entered the capital without too much difficulty and managed to go almost unnoticed until they were only 100 meters from the Blue House. It was at that moment that the security teams protecting the South Korean president discovered the operation. Fire was then exchanged between the North Korean command and the South soldiers and police, an exchange that took the lives of the command and dozens of South Koreans. All of this happened just 100 meters from the president's bedroom. Finally, the assault ended with the capture of one of the members of the operation. The rest of those who survived the shooting took poison to avoid being interrogated. No, really, they took poison. Like, that is literally something out of a James Bond movie. North Korean spies are trained and indoctrinated to simply take their own lives before being forced to reveal any information to the enemy. Obviously, this extreme decision is influenced by what may happen to their families. As you can surely imagine in North Korea, the life that the family of a fallen hero can have is a far cry from the life of the family members of someone considered a traitor or a deserter. But let's not get sidetracked. The second assassination attempt against Park occurred just 5 years later, in 1974, at the National Theatre of Korea, during the day of celebration of liberation from Japanese occupation. Interestingly, it was a Japanese-born North Korean infiltrator named Moon Se-kwang who shot the president from the audience. However, it was not Park, but sadly his wife, the First Lady, who died shortly thereafter. But if all this seems like a movie, we haven't even finished the trailer yet. Wait until we tell you what the North Koreans did in 1987, a year before the Seoul Olympics. Of course, the North Korean dictator Kim Il-sung was not happy that South Korea was to host the 1998 Olympics. Naturally, during that year, the South would be one of the main international players in the news, a perfect opportunity to show the world the enormous development the country was experiencing. So, the first step the North Korean leader took was to announce that a kind of parallel socialist Olympics, the so-called World Youth and Student Festival, would be held in North Korea in 1989. This was a $4 billion event for which the Pyongyang regime built a giant $200 million Olympic stadium, the famous May Day Stadium, the largest in the world. But don't forget that at the time North Korea was already a very poor country. It certainly doesn't seem like the best decision in the world to spend resources you don't have on organising a socialist Olympics while your people are starving. Let's call that a dictator's whim. But the fact is that unfortunately, the North Koreans did not stop there. The worst was Kim's evil plan to wipe out the Seoul Games, a plan that was aimed at scaring the world and creating the feeling, the idea that going to Seoul for the Olympics was not safe at all. So what better way to do it than to shoot down a Korean Air plane full of passengers? And no, we're not kidding you. In fact, that is precisely what they did. In 1987, months before the 1998 Olympic Games, 2 North Korean spies boarded Flight 858 between Baghdad and Seoul, with stops in Abu Dhabi and Bangkok. The spies got off the plane at the Abu Dhabi stopover, leaving a bomb with a timer inside. Shortly thereafter, the plane exploded, killing 115 people. During the escape, the 2 spies, Kim Sung-il, a 70-year-old man, and Kim Hyung-hwai, a 26-year-old woman, were captured. Kim Song-il succeeded in ingesting the poison that North Korean spies always carry on their missions, but Kim Hyung-hwai was not successful and was taken to Seoul. She was traveling on a Japanese passport, posing as a Japanese person, because she'd had language and manners classes given to her in North Korea by a Japanese woman who had been kidnapped. This, by the way, has been another of North Korea's favourite activities for decades, kidnapping people from other countries, especially Japanese and South Koreans. The fact is that the female spy was sentenced to death, but she got a presidential pardon. It stood to reason that this woman was a valuable source of information for South Korean services, and so, of course, she was worth more alive. However, her expressions of repentance earned her South Korean nationality and even the forgiveness of some of the victims' families. Currently, this former spy is 58 years old and lives in a secret location in South Korea. Secret for fear of being killed by North Korean agents, she has offered several interviews in which she has said things like these.
When I confessed, I did so reluctantly. I thought my family in North Korea would be in danger. It was a big decision to confess, but I began to realize it would be the right thing to do for the victims, for them to be able to understand the truth. There is no other country like North Korea. The whole country is set up to show loyalty to the Kim royal family. It's like a religion. There are no human rights, no freedoms. Eventually, when I met the victims' families, we were all in tears, hugging and crying. Kim Hyun-hwi, former North Korean spy.
But take note, because letting spies live and ensuring their safety to obtain information is not the only protection measure that South Korea has developed. In fact, it is not even the most important one. The main one is the National Security Act, formerly called the Anti-Communist Act. This law regulates absolutely everything about contacts with the northern neighbour. For example, if a South Korean wants to travel to North Korea, this law states that the trip can only take place if there is a very justified reason and if it is approved by the government. This act also prohibits all North Korean books or those that glorify the regime or communism, just as it serves as a legal umbrella for prosecuting and blocking North Korean or pro-Pyongyang websites. This law is basically intended to eliminate any ideological content that the North Korean regime could use to extend its influence in the South. The question is though, should a government limit access to its citizens of certain content, even if that content is an apology for totalitarianism? This is not a minor question, so in typical VisualPolitik style, let's open up a debate in the comments. But anyway, at this point, I'm sure some of you are thinking, okay Grant, okay, these cases you've told us about are events that happened more than 3 decades ago. That's a very long time ago. But what about now? Are there still North Korean spies in the South today? And the answer is yes, there has always been. And while the number of operational commands is undetermined, of course, they are believed to number in the hundreds. They gather information, terrorize South Korean officials and politicians, steal industrial designs, and seek ways to bypass international sanctions. But without a doubt, the type of espionage that has the most pull right now for the North Koreans is not this type of espionage. Let's call it traditional, the likes of 007, of planted agents, but the one that's going on online, cyber espionage. In fact, in just a few years, North Korea has gone from making botched cyber attacks to being a much feared country in the world of cybersecurity, something we have already talked about here on VisualPolitik. But would you like to know a little more about this new battlefield? If so, let's go there.
Neo-espionage.
When it comes to doing evil, all innovation can be bent to your will. Right? Do you remember the NSA techniques we saw in a past video? If you haven't seen it, I'll leave a link in the description. The fact is that this is exactly what North Korea, one of the poorest and most technologically backward countries in the world, seems to have thought. It currently has an elite squad of computer hackers. We are talking about the APT-37 group, a whole army of around 6,000 hackers who are fundamentally dedicated to 3 things: carrying out computer attacks against enemy countries, industrial espionage, particularly of the military industry, and finally, the creation and dispersal of viruses that create havoc and swindle money. The most notorious of the latter was the WannaCry virus, which attacked and disabled around 300,000 computers worldwide in 2017. And not only that, as we told you before, North Korea has also used its army of cyber soldiers to steal $81 million from a bank in Bangladesh and to destroy Sony Pictures servers in response to the film The Interview, in which the Kim Jong-un character was, spoilers, murdered. But we don't even have to go that far back in time. There is much more recent activity. Check out this headline.
August 2020. North Korea cyber attacks Israel. Steals classified data which could be sold to Iran.
Yeah, that's right. It was confirmed just last month that the North Korean hackers had managed to defeat the cyber defenses of the Israeli army, one of the most technologically prepared bodies in the world. This attack, which technically was more industrial cyber spying, focused on stealing data from weapons models, and it's not certain where that data will end up. And the fact is that, apart from their own use, we cannot forget that Iran, Israel's arch enemy, is an ally of North Korea, and they may have turned to the North Korean APT-37 group for sweet revenge by taking over their most secret information. The point is, if in its physical dimension the North Korean army doesn't seem to be ready to attack other countries or do missions abroad, why not form a good team of hackers and do it over the internet from home? Finally, working remotely has come to North Korea. The move seems masterful. What's more, they can use this method to steal information from companies, for example, patents, and then be able to produce their own copies. But now, as always, we leave it over to you. Do you think that South Korea should have responded militarily to the numerous incursions of North Korean spies and special agents? Is the world safe from the nascent North Korean cyber military superpower? As always, we'll ask you to leave your answers in the comments. So, we really hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And, as always, I'll see you in the next video.